To say that you could cut the tension with a knife would be an understatement. Spike found himself struggling to stay awake as he looked out the window of the train as it charged towards Canterlot. The lack of sleep was starting to take its toll on the baby dragon. The only thing that was keeping him awake was the thought of Twilight turning. As he weakly looked across the table, he saw the tired unicorn, herself barely conscious as her eyes drooped before her head abruptly darted up, eyes wide with fear. But soon she began to doze off. The cool arms of slumber began to embrace her. Spike tried to open his mouth to speak up, but he too found the darkness flooding over the sight. "No!" Spike's mind screamed as he shook himself, before he called out to the sleeping unicorn, "Twilight!" No answer. He shouted again. Still nothing. He soon found himself starting to panic, but then he took a moment to sit back up in his chair. Spike's body stayed as stiff as a board as he watched the purple unicorn sleep, but then he started to calm down, thinking to himself, "It's been days. I bet she hasn't slept all that time, since that happened." He smiled. It was the first time he had seen Twilight so calm and still, not rushing around or trying to kill him. He sighed to himself, trying to convince himself that it'll be okay. Maybe she'll find out who started this war. Maybe this whole nightmare can end. Spiky! Spike's eyes shot open. His heart shot into his throat as he saw the chair in front of him was now empty. Suddenly, a shadow loomed over him, instantly filling his heart with fear. Without thinking, Spike threw himself to the ground. His grunts of pain were soon overshadowed by the loud crash echoing throughout the carriage. Opening his eyes, he saw a pile of his clothes and belongings spilled all over the floor, as well as Twilight's. Suddenly, the carriage was silent. Spike held his breath, trying to clear his vision, as he could hear his heartbeat pounding in his ears. Tense moments passed. Still no sound. Spike tried to think of it as a hallucination, but then the eagle giggles of the insane pony were heard once again. Suddenly, a tornado constructed of paper scrolls and quills exploded from the center of the carriage, rocking it from side to side. Spike yelped. He couldn't see through the parchment storm in front of him, and then suddenly, everything fell to the ground, revealing the lavender unicorn, which was sat down, giggling at the floorboards. Spike's vision cleared, and he was struck with horror. Not only had the monster in Twilight's mind taken over her body again, but Spike could also see disturbing red marks going down the left side of her body, branded like tattoos, but looked like veins and arteries. The marks went along her hooves, her leafless branches. They clung to her body, almost making Twilight unrecognizable. In fact, the only thing that could resemble Twilight was the distinctive burn on her flank, where her cutie mark was before she watched her best friend, Rainbow Dash, plummet to her death. "Spike," the monster said in a mocking voice. "Spikey." Her voice was distorted, like every demon in Equestria was in her body. Spike could hear a deep bellowing growl, a menacing snicker, and the screech of young fillies' voices talking at the same time. "Hello, Spikey." The purple dragon recoiled in horror as the possessed unicorn looked up at him. Those eyes, they stared directly into the deepest depths of his soul, like red orbs with black ink swimming in the center and white dots which resembled the pupils. Spike could clearly see the freak staring at him, which only made this whole ordeal even more terrifying. "Twilight?" he whimpered, in a vain attempt to snap Twilight out of this psychotic state. But nothing happened. Instead, the unicorn stood up, looking like it was using all its strength to do so. "What the hell's going on here?" a colt's voice shouted from behind. Spike's hopes soared, but soon went down again. To his horror, the monster's horn began to glow. Its newfound power slammed the doors of the carriage shut, locking them for good measure, before anyone could run in and help. The scrolls were picked up off the ground and began to circle the room once again. No pony could see in or out of the room. Spike found himself pushed against the door, behind him, but it was almost shielded shut. There was nowhere he could run. He scruffled into a corner, as the psychotic monster was only inches away from him. "Who are you? What do you want?" It smiled. Its toothy grin was also red with those gruesome marks. "What do I want?" Suddenly a silence swept the room. You could hear a pin drop. Even the raging storm around them fell silent as Twilight's puppeteer disappeared and whispered, "Death to all, and thyself." The deafening storm came back as the demon jumped to its hind legs, neighing at the sky before shouting in an ear-shattering tone, "Death to existence!" Spike looked past Twilight. A crowd of unicorns and earth ponies were trying desperately to open the door, but there was no use. Spike was doomed. Spike gave one last look at the madness before her hooves came crashing down on her assistant's head. Spike was lucky. His scales had made him tough to injure, but that didn't stop the beast from trying. Again and again it struck its hooves, harder and harder on his head. Spike screamed, but nobody heard him over the chaos. Spike cringed. There was only one way. He could think to save himself. I'm sorry." Spike took a deep breath before forcing a fireball from the depths of his lungs and into the unicorn's face. Spike saw his chance. The beast screamed, wailing as its body was burnt in the combustion. Spike began to crawl away. His legs were shaking too much for him to stand up. Suddenly, the screaming ceased, and Spike was stopped in his tracks in a bubble of light as it consumed his body. The baby dragon was forced onto his stomach. He couldn't move. He screamed again, but to no avail. Spike could see in the reflection. It was standing right over him. "Chomp!" Spike screamed again. He felt the unicorn's teeth grab his scales and slowly begin to pluck them off of his back one by one. Spike wanted to flail about wildly, but he was held still as the torture commenced. Soon, a good chunk of scales were missing from his back, leaving only soft, leathery-like texture. Spike closed his eyes. He knew what was coming. All Twilight had to do now was plunge something into his back, and that would be it. He felt the scalding hot tip of Twilight's horn press into his flesh. Spike began to blow fireballs everywhere he could. He had to do something. Anything. Twilight reared up, about to deliver the final blow. Spike closed his eyes. This was it. Suddenly, the bubbles surrounding his body began to fade. He could move again. He looked back. The monster's look of lust for blood was diminished into a look of fear and despair. Everything fell silent once again, as Twilight's horn grew brighter and brighter. Suddenly, a beam of light exploded from her horn, destroying the entire right side of the carriage. Papers, belongings, everything flew out of the train and into the countryside. Then Twilight screamed. She screamed as loud as her lungs could take, before her body fell limp to the ground. Spike pushed himself onto his feet, ready to run to the door, but then he saw Twilight's body rolling towards the edge of the train. Without thinking, he ran as fast as he could, grabbing Twilight's tail as she fell off the edge. Spike dug the claws of his free hand into the hard wood of the floor, stopping both of them and Twilight from falling to their deaths. His arms burned. His claws began to slip. Then he heard the door crashing open. "Help!" he screamed, as loud as he could. Rip. Twilight's tail was tearing. He couldn't move, but in a matter of seconds, mares and colts from all directions ran to his aid. Spike was relieved, but then he saw that they were trying to pull him in. "No! Twilight! Help Twilight!" The train's whistle roared as Twilight looked down the tracks. A tunnel was in sight, and already the locomotive was inside. He had seconds left. Using all of his might, Spike growled as he tried to lift Twilight in his left arm. His arm slumped, but his grip remained firm. Ponies from all around him tried everything to reach down to Twilight, but there was nothing they could do without falling out themselves. Spike looked down the train again. The tunnel was 2 coaches down. He had moments to make a choice. Let go and live, and Twilight might possibly survive the fall down the steep hill, or try and lift again, with the risk the tunnel could kill them both. Spike's eyes momentarily glowed green as he made his decision. With one earth-shattering yell, he used what remaining strength he had to toss Twilight over himself and back into the carriage. Then, all of a sudden, the wreck of the coach turned dark as Spike drifted out of consciousness, as his last ounce of energy was spent, closing his eyes.